Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox back again for another live recording of Everything Compliance. We are thrilled to be joined as special guest panelists this week by Dr. Hema Lomax, Chief Compliance Officer at DocuSign. Hema, first of all, welcome to this week's edition.
Thank you so much. Happy to be here with you amazing gentlemen. Appreciate it.
So we generally go in geographic order, but it may be a little off, but we're going to do Mr. Armstrong, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Marks, and Hema, you will back clean up. And I will come in with a few remarks after that. So, Mr. Armstrong, what do you have for us today?
Yeah, well, I guess like many people, I've been watching the spat between Trump and Musk, and I'm not going to go into too much detail. A, because maybe it does have stuff to do with compliance, maybe not. But B, it's evolving by by the minute, and it's bound to be out of date by the time people listen to the recording. I did like a comment from a friend last night there who said, it's a shame there's a tariff on popcorn. Otherwise, this would be an interesting fight. And I don't want to say I told you so. I guess it was probably obvious, but I think I did say on this podcast the very first time we talked about this bromance that it was doomed to fail. And of course it did. So I'm using this as an excuse to revive one of my previous predictions about Elon Musk and where this might lead. Now, if we assume that they don't kiss and make up, and maybe they can put their egos aside, then where does this go? Can Trump continue to be somewhat vindictive about Musk terminating federal contracts, for example, and where could it go after that? Now, in March 2023, Mary Shirley and I spoke at the SCCE conference in Amsterdam, and we spoke in part about false ESG claims and those corporations that had pretended to be, in the words of the song, I guess, green all over, but in fact weren't. And I was always interested by the thoughts of the late great Richard Levick, who wrote a few books like this on communications in a crisis. And Richard had a theory that Musk was especially vulnerable to things like fake ESG claims litigation because he'd painted himself as one of the liberal elite. He'd pushed back against people who said there was no such thing as global warming. He'd effectively identified himself as one of their tribe, and how a lot of people who'd bought Teslas, for example, as a result, identifying him as a climate hero, would feel deceived by his apparent lurch to the right. And what we did back in 2023 is had a look at some of the figures behind Tesla's, am I allowed to say, success rather than success. And it may or may not surprise people to know that a lot of Tesla's revenue has been funded by carbon credits. Well, what are carbon credits? Well, effectively, in this case, they are credits to Tesla for creating EV vehicles. And Tesla have monetized these credits by selling them to manufacturers of diesel vehicles in simplistic terms. So this hasn't been an all-out crusade to reduce diesel emissions. This has been a crusade to gather credits that they could sell to other corporations to offset the diesel emissions from their vehicles. And you might think, well, that must be a trivial amount of money. Dear listener, it is not. In 2024 alone, Tesla made 2.76 billion with a B, $2.76 billion worth of profit out of these carbon credits. Since 2017, Tesla has made $10.4 billion out of selling carbon credits. That's in some quarters more profitable than the vehicles. 30% of net income has been selling credits. And so what does that mean? Well, there's a rising tide in ESG related litigation, particularly in Europe, but elsewhere. KLM, for example, have been in the Dutch courts over claims that their air travel was green. And of course, no air travel is really green. As an aside, space travel ain't green either. And whenever we talk about zero emissions, that sort of thing doesn't really exist. EVs are heavier on roads, for example. That means that they have more emissions from tires. Any F1 fan will tell you about tire degradation. As vehicles increase in weight, tire degradation increases, and some people say that tire particulate is more harmful for breathing and for the environment than diesel emissions. So, whenever you're saying that you've got a zero emission vehicle, generally speaking, you're in trouble with regulators. For example, the UK regulator, the ASA, hit upon a vehicle manufacturer, not Tesla in this case, for claiming that their car drove well on a certain road and was kinder to the environment. The the regulator measured the distance between this particular piece of road and the nearest charging point and said at that time your hybrid vehicle could not have been driving on battery because of the distance, and the claim was false as a result. The UK advertising regulator has also hit on zero emissions claims, making the same point as I just did about ancillary emissions from tire degradation from the manufacturer of the vehicle, etc., etc. So some may say that Tesla's claims are a big ESG fraud. They're certainly a misleading statement in some cases on the benefits of Tesla vehicles, particularly when you factor in manufacturing, the location of some of the components, etc., etc. And just as ESG claims are rising in Europe and pressure group activity is increasing, then of course there's the possibility of similar litigation in the US or even regulatory activity. I'm no expert in US regulatory law. It seems to me it possibly comes within the Federal Trade Commission's jurisdiction. Obviously, false claims is a big area in the US with monetized whistleblowers, etc., etc. So I'm going to repeat my March 2023 prediction of I think someone, somewhere, will be brave enough to take on the Tesla environment and look forensically at the environmental claims they've made. And given yesterday's developments, I don't rule that out as someone close to Trump.
Matt, do you have a question or comment for Mr. Armstrong?
I suppose a comment, because I think you're really onto something there, Jonathan, that a lot of people have said over the years that Tesla is, to some extent, a bit of a financial house of cards because of the tax credits that on many quarters and in many years, the sale of those carbon credits is what kept Tesla afloat. And when Tesla said, we make money, they weren't making money from selling the cars. They were only making money from selling the tax credits. I'm not sure exactly off the top of my head how true that still is today. But there are plenty of people who have criticized Tesla for that before. I think you raise a good point about more broadly this idea of carbon offsets that a lot of businesses will use to claim that they are being green. I've never quite understood that, because if I am a heavy polluter and I buy a lot of carbon offsets from somebody else who is now promising not to make carbon emissions, and then they go ahead and they do anyway, the recourse here is what exactly? I'm supposed to suck my carbon back into my lungs? Like, it's done. So I was always struck when the SEC did have its greenhouse gas emissions rule, may it now rest in peace because the Trump administration has essentially smothered it. that rule said you had to publish your absolute greenhouse gas emissions. You want to publish the offset number 2, you can, but it's more like a footnote of what the net emissions are. You had to say very prominently, this is the carbon we are actually putting into the air, even if we're promising that somebody somewhere else is going to plant a tree in like New Zealand or Africa or the Sierras or something like that. I also think that, yes, probably the Federal Trade Commission is going to look at greenwashing more because, let's be honest, the Trump administration doesn't like green anything. And if there's a chance to stick it to people so they will make fewer environmentally friendly disclosures, I think the FTC would jump on that with both feet. And people should be thinking about that. And how would you therefore confirm that all these gauzy things that you say, it is very easy to say that you're being green, but, are you actually being green? That is not easy, as everybody knows from Kermit the Frog. And you're going to have to be able to back that up with real evidence.
Yeah, and I think that's a really valid point, isn't it? I think when I wrote an article on this for SCCE, I think at the time as well, and I think we forget sometimes that the burden of proof is on the person who makes the claim in most jurisdictions. So I need not remind our dear listeners of the original Latin maxim, e incumbit probatio qui decit, non qui negat. But the legal principle is that if you make the claim, you have to be able to back it up. And the UK regulators particularly have been very aggressive in terms of asking to see that evidence. And the evidence obviously must predate the claim. So for compliance officers generally, I think this is a potential area of litigation, of regulatory activity. Compliance officers, I think, sometimes have to do the work of saying to the marketing teams, those who are making these claims, let's see the evidence. Let's see that these claims are verifiable. Otherwise, they can't be made.
So it strikes me if the federal contracts go through for $400 million of the Tesla war machine, we could have potential False Claims Act claim.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm sure Mary Inman would be very interested to hear about that. And there might even be some serious FCA payback somewhere down the road.
Yeah, I think that seems very likely. That whole way in which these claims can be monetized, I think, will be a space to watch.
All right, Matt, we have had some interesting developments around the general topic of compliance over the past, at least since we were together last. I know several of them have piqued your interest. What do you have for us?
Well, actually, Tom, just to add some breaking news to the Trump-Tesla greenwashing issues here, Trump did just say earlier today that, remember a couple of months ago, he bought that Tesla from Elon. He paid $90,000 for it, and he showed it off on the White House lawn. He's going to sell it back. He's going to put it out on the secondary market. Mr. President, you are going to be so pissed when you see the resale value on a used Tesla, because that's dropping like a stone. But, dude, you bought it. You should have known what you were getting into with Elon. Here you are. So, yes, we have a couple of really interesting settlements lately that involve a lot of compliance spending from some very notable companies. And I guess mostly wanted to zero in on the biggest one of all is Google. So earlier this week or late last week, I think, Google agreed to settle a shareholder lawsuit over poor compliance and governance over at Google's antitrust practices, where Google committed to spend $500 million over the next 10 years to overhaul its compliance program. In many different ways, I think this is fascinating. First off, because I'm still struggling to figure out, is $500 million actually a lot of money? I suspect it's probably bigger than the budgets of most listeners. However, this is $500 million spread out over 10 years. So that's, I'm guessing, about $50 million a year on average. But Google does make $350 billion in revenue these days. That was their 2024 revenue. They have a compound annual growth rate. I went and I calculated this at a running around 14% for the last 4 years. So if that continues out into the future, which who knows, they're going to be making gobs and gobs more money, hundreds of billions of dollars in revenue every year. I'm not necessarily sure that 500 million is a lot, But then again, it's a fascinating question. Do you need it to be? Like, how much money do you need to have a big effect on compliance? If they were going to commit to spending 250 million instead of 500 million, would their compliance be only half as effective as what they've just committed to? Like, I'm not sure how the math equates and what that equation is, but nonetheless, they have promised to spend $500 million on new compliance programs. We can talk about exactly what in a minute or two. They have promised to create a risk and compliance committee on the board, which raises an interesting question of whether they might change up the size and nature of their board right now. Google currently has 10 board directors. 7 of them are outsiders. Those 7 are already assigned to the typical 3 of the audit committee, the nominating and governance compensation committee. So I don't know that you can create a 4th committee with those 7 members without so much overlap as to be essentially meaningless. It is supposed to be a dedicated risk and compliance committee on the board that will see all non-financial compliance issues. The audit, financial compliance, Sarbanes-Oxley, that still goes to the old audit committee. Now you're going to have a new risk and compliance committee. I'm wondering that maybe they're going to have some more board members. We can dare to dream. Would Google actually recruit a compliance officer to be on that board if they are going to recruit more members, which in my opinion, they should. But that's going to be one thing. They are going to have multiple in-house compliance councils. One is going to exist at a council of senior vice presidents from across Google, which at this point is now a very big, sprawling organization. That is going to be, I think it's called the Trust and Compliance Committee. There's going to be another committee underneath them, slightly larger, of more operating managers. That is going to be the Trust Support Compliance Committee, or the Trust and Compliance Support Committee. There's the TCC and the TCSC beneath it. And that lower level one is going to have compliance officers and business operating people paired up, and a committee of those pairs to support the senior level VP committee. However, this brings me to another question, and listeners out there, if you know the answer, please let me know. Does anybody actually know who Google's chief compliance officer is right now? Because I don't know that they actually have one. I've been researching this. I have not reached out to Google to ask. I suppose I should, and I will. But they did have a chief compliance officer, Spiro Karetsos, until he left mid last year, when they also lost a bunch of other compliance and privacy people. So they're clearly going to have to restructure and staff up and expand their compliance function. Does that mean they're going to have a big, high-profile chief ethics and compliance officer? Not sure yet. And then the other big thing that I thought was interesting was, let's remember what started this was not a regulatory investigation. The regulatory investigations were already ongoing, but then the shareholders, which were 2 pension funds up in Michigan, they were upset with these regulatory investigations. So they filed a shareholder lawsuit against Google and the board, their complaint being Google's antitrust efforts were so sloppy and so haphazard that it was costing the company and the shareholders a fortune. That shareholder lawsuit has led to this settlement and this promise to spend $500 million on compliance over the next 10 years. The actual antitrust investigations against Google, which are many and have not gone well for the company, those are still in train. Google lost one in 2023 over abusive power pricing for its App Store. It lost another one in 2024 for monopolization of search results. It lost another case in just this past April over monopolization of the ad search market. In all 3 cases, the judges in those disputes were not at all pleased with what they saw as suspiciously poor record-keeping capabilities among Google's senior-most executives. So part of this is going to be they're going to have a big records retention policy overhaul. But there's a lot going on at Google. My other big question, and this will be the last one, I do wonder whether Google is now going to start publishing an annual compliance program report. I am a big fan of this genre of nonfiction. We have a lot of them from time to time over the years. Most recently, Boeing, which also just settled a case with the Justice Department, where Boeing had promised to spend $445 million over 3 years for compliance program improvements. But Boeing had been publishing its own compliance program updates. Exelon is another one that they had a big regulatory settlement. They were publishing annual compliance progress reports to the public. I don't know if Google is going to start publishing those too. Would be awesome if somebody did, because I'd love to know how this is going to work in practice. But, there's a lot of promises from some big companies these days to really improve their compliance programs. They're putting a lot of money into it. I'll be curious to see how this all goes.
Emma, do you have a comment or question for Matt?
Yeah, Matt, it's funny. Don't we like to say as compliance officers, never waste a good crisis, and because we're going to get the money then. And look, Google's now throwing, what did you say? 500 million?
500 million, yeah.
Oh, a lot of money. Yeah, 500 million at that. I remember when Boeing said they were throwing a lot of money at their compliance program. I guess that's not necessary now, but here we are. Let's talk about Google and the committees that you talked about. I wonder, when we get excited as compliance professionals that there's some money coming, what are we doing in terms of thinking about using that money effectively? One of the things you talked about was all these committees that are being built, and it's a common piece of our toolkit, isn't it? More training, more committees, more governance. My thought here is, it's really a question, is how can we make those activities more impactful? Or how can we be more purposeful about designing those activities? I'd love your thoughts on this, Matt, but one idea I've been playing with recently is making sure that we ask one coaching question of ourselves when we decide to do these things. And that is it decision useful? Is there anything that these committees are going to do that are going to help Google make good decisions going forward? And I would think you could filter out a lot of the mess and a lot of the noise just by that one question. So I'd love your thoughts, but how can you make sense of this massive activity and make it more impactful?
That is, I think, the excellent question, because it almost seems like Google is just throwing money at the problem to make it go away. But I mean, they're certainly going to be throwing it over a long time horizon. The settlement that they had, which is still pending final judge approval, but it doesn't seem like there's going to be any natural obstacle arising to it. But it does shed some light on this question of how are you going to spend that money productively. Part of the settlement says that Google is going to have to adopt an enterprise risk management framework, and that spells out some of what Google is supposed to do. I can call up some of it here. They're going to be placing compliance specialists across all the business units, integrating compliance with product and business teams. So that's going to be support for engineers, support for product managers. I assume that means thinking more about compliance interests and risks as you're coming up with the new product or the new market that you're going to launch, whether that's being coded up or whether it's being scaled up because it's now the product exists and it's ready to go out to the market. There's going to be a lot of tracking of key risk indicators. It's interesting because so much of this settlement is about antitrust. And I get it that when you're as large as Google in a market that is uniquely prone to antitrust and monopolistic size and issues, that makes a lot of sense. But I do kind of wonder, are there $500 million worth of antitrust risks out there? I mean, maybe there are. I am not an antitrust specialist. I don't know. But, there are so many different other ethics and compliance issues that large companies have to worry about too. Could you incorporate some of that at least into what you're trying to do here? Is that anything Google is interested in? I do also wonder, one other point that I didn't raise earlier is, will we see shareholders sue other companies for something like this? And I saw some discussion of that on LinkedIn, and it was interesting that the shareholders sued the company here because the harm they suffered was from regulatory enforcement. There was too much of it. We shouldn't have had it because we should have been doing the right thing. So now we're suing you. If there isn't regulatory enforcement, does that mean shareholders would have less reason to sue? Maybe this is going to be kind of sui generis. I'm not sure. On the other hand, the Trump administration does not like big tech companies. But if you're pharmaceutical, you're probably still going to be regulated. And if you didn't have good regulatory capabilities, people might die. You might have defective pills or defective food and drug products. So I could see shareholders suing for that. But I wonder how much we might actually see shareholder lawsuits being the vehicle for big compliance settlements like this. I don't know, because clearly the appetite for stiff regulatory enforcement is going to be diminished in the Trump administration. That's that. So it's a fascinating case study, but I'm not sure exactly how applicable it might be to all companies. I just haven't had time to think about it yet.
Well, let me pick up on that last point, because that was one of the things I wanted to raise in the context of your remarks, Matt. Shareholder lawsuits obviously are an additional risk for corporations, but in the compliance world, they have been used in the past to improve compliance. When I was at Halliburton, or after Halliburton's first FCPA violation, there was a shareholder lawsuit, and the settlement was a new set of committees. There was a compliance committee at the board. Equally important, there was a EVP level compliance committee between the CCO and the board of directors. And it had the COO, the EVPs, the head of HR, head of IT, and the CCO. What that did was, and they were going into the weeds, literally approving third parties, because was how far behind the eight ball Halliburton's compliance program was. And it lasted about 3 years. But what it did was bring a level of visibility of detailed issues to compliance to these EVPs that they had never had before. And it gave the CCO the opportunity to have direct interactions literally on a monthly basis with everyone on that committee. So there was one other shareholder suit, and I've forgotten the name of the company, but the settlement was once again dollars and structures around compliance. So we have seen this in the past. And what I wanted to highlight is a shareholder suit is a way to garner compliance improvements. As to the committee at the board, anytime you can have a board committee dedicated to compliance, I'm 110% for that. And the reason is that's their remit. Their remit is not around audit. It's not around finances. It's around compliance. And having that specific focus of a committee is something that is good and positive. Now, most of us, we don't know the status of the Google compliance program and antitrust, anti-corruption, money laundering, or other areas. Maybe they are 10 years down and $500 million down. Maybe not. But whatever they're doing with this money, it's going to increase compliance. And for all of those reasons, I think it's a good first step. Now you have to execute on that first step, and you have to continue to execute. But this type of spending should be welcome from the regulatory perspective, from the shareholder perspective, hopefully from the employee perspective, and certainly from the third party or customer perspective as well. So the shareholder lawsuit is a valid way or we've seen it make changes in compliance. The changes that Google has made, we don't know if they're instituting a basic hotline or it's something else, but wherever they are, they're not where they felt like they needed to be.
Well, I mean, I do agree with that in principle, Tom, but we're not going to see shareholder lawsuits over poor FCPA compliance anytime soon, because we're not going to have FCPA enforcement anytime soon. And I do wonder if, as we see places like Texas start new, essentially being corporate governance free-for-alls, where if the CEO of a Texas incorporated company, I think, what's the rule there, Tom? If they burn the company to the ground, the shareholders allowed to say you suck in the ashes and then sell the stock. I mean, you're not going to have much recourse in some of these venues. So I do wonder how much shareholders would be able to do it. It's a fascinating example, and I do think shareholders should be have a way to hold companies accountable. But there's a larger environment that is changing around here, so I don't know. It's just, I'm curious to see how it evolves.
Well, there's lots of comments in the chat. Anybody else have something for Matt or a comment? All right, Mr. Marks, what do you have for us today?
Good segue, Matt. Thanks for that plug. Governance. So, Obviously there's the whole GRC, governance, risk, and compliance burble that just keeps rearing its head over and over again, either through regulation or through failure. And so, it's important to tell the audience that governance, risk, and compliance is a waterfall concept. You have to have good governance, which leads to good risk management, and good risk management drives compliance. Not any other way. There is no other machination of this. That's the way it's supposed to work. And not surprisingly, I think the regulatory bodies and the standard setting bodies are paying close attention to that. And so I'm going to talk about something that came out about a week and a half ago, and that was COSO's new corporate governance framework released for public exposure. And now, if you know COSO, their name is basically synonymous with internal control, enterprise risk management, and fraud prevention. Their frameworks have really just shaped boardrooms and audit committees for decades. But now, for the first time, COSO, along with the National Association of Corporate Directors, the NACD, have developed a dedicated principle-based corporate governance framework designed to help organizations appears to be navigate the increasingly complex, high-stakes environment that they're operating in, which is a lot of what we're talking about and what we talk about regularly. I've been burbling about governance for years and years. I actually have a framework that I've been using, the 7 concentric circles of corporate governance, which, I've looked at their new sort of picture on all of this. I think it makes some sense, but I think it's missing pieces and components. Not too surprising to anybody that I'm criticizing here, but not for the sake of knocking them down, but for the sake of not thinking through all the components that really do need to be, or all the elements that really should be in a governance framework. And so I hope that Paul Sobel or somebody from COSO is listening to this podcast, because I do have some thoughts which I actually have published in my weekly writings, which I hope that they actually look at. So really, what is COSO proposing here? I think everybody really would like to know. I spent a lot of time reading through this. It makes a lot of sense. Some of it's sort of like, okay, this is what we knew, but I think it provides, at least foundationally, for those that are kind of clueless as to how to approach some of this stuff, to build something, or at least check themselves, and see if what they have actually does make sense. So really, at the heart of the framework are 6 core components, which are supposed to work in concert to drive effective governance. Oversight, no surprise there, right? Strategy, culture, people, communication, and resilience. Those are the 6 components that they lay out, which I don't disagree with. I think they're great, but I think there's other components that really merge and integrate with them. And I'm not going to talk about that on this podcast, but maybe at a future one, I can do a little bit more of a deeper dive. And like I said, these aren't standalone silos. They're interconnected levers that guide how boards, executives, and organizations supposedly supposed to govern with some type of purpose. For example, oversight covers board structure, independence, committee responsibilities, and the delegation of authority. But the framework actually, from reading it, pushes beyond the traditional governance checklists. It calls for thoughtful board composition. Great. That's what it should be, right? Rigorous CEO selection. Again, these are, you might be saying, well, we know this, but a lot of folks aren't doing this. Ongoing succession planning. Again, a topic that is near and dear to me. And routine evaluation of board performance. While this is supposedly is going on, it's not as effective as it probably could be. And some organizations are simply not doing that. The strategy component, which I think is kind of interesting too, that's where governance really does intersect with execution, and it ensures that an entity's purpose, values, and long-term goals are really embedded in the decision making. There's been a lot of commentary online of late about risk appetite and risk tolerance, and do those things actually allow people to make better decisions? And it's kind of an interesting diatribe that's going on in the social sphere. But in COSO, it actually emphasizes adaptability, something every organization needs in the face of these economic, technological, and geographical disruptions, which we're all facing. Let's face it, the risk landscape 2 weeks ago is not the same risk landscape that we're dealing with now. It just isn't. Things are changing. And speaking of disruption, obviously, why now? I think, again, sort of everyone might be going, well, isn't it obvious? Well, like I said, the business environment is really shifting rapidly. We're seeing a convergence of these challenges that we have internally, like for and externally, like cyber threats, regulatory uncertainty. Mac talked about, no prosecution of FCPA type of issues. How does that affect what's going on or the mindset of anybody, especially at the board level or from a compliance perspective? AI and data ethics is another one. Environmental and social pressures. Jonathan, you brought up, these environmental type things. And the growing voice of investors and employees that are demanding, actually pounding their fists on the table, demanding transparency and accountability. So, in short, these expectations of good governance have never really been higher. Again, it's something that and Tom knows and Matt knows, and the good doctor probably doesn't know, but Jonathan certainly knows. I've been pounding my fist pretty heavily for a long time about people not understanding governance or paying attention to all this. So, but here's the problem. Most organizations are dealing with fragmented governance models. Again, this is my opinion. You've got one model for cybersecurity oversight, another for ESG, a third for compliance, and so on and so on and so on. That fragmentation, the way I see it, creates inefficiency, inconsistency, and blind spots. It just does. And so I think what the COSO framework is trying to do, it's trying to offer a unified, flexible structure. Again, not one size fits all, but a common language that can be tailored by any company, public companies, private firms, not-for-profits, public sector organizations, and so on and so forth. It's designed to be scalable based on my read and sector agnostic. And so, which is critical in today's governance landscape for sure. So let's talk briefly about the stakeholders, and then I'll try to wrap this up. So when you look at the governance framework, it explicitly acknowledges that governance doesn't stop at the board or the C-level suite, right? Which is the same thing that we talk about risk and we talk about compliance. So it doesn't stop there. So shareholders, regulators, employees, and communities all have a role to play. So the framework in itself encourages boards and management to engage with this multi-stakeholder reality head on and to treat transparency and accountability as competitive advantages, not burdens. And I think that's really important. And accountability, again, is one of those things. If you ever saw my risk resilient ecosystem, my enterprise risk resilient ecosystem, you'll see down the left-hand side, accountability is one of the biggest things that I have in there. And if you don't have accountability, you really don't have anything. So, but it also, in this particular writing from COSO in this draft, it also recognizes that culture, right? What people do when no one's watching, and we've talked about that ad nauseum, is a core governance issue. So boards can no longer treat culture as sort of this abstract, amorphous, or secondary type of thing. So COSO's culture component emphasizes ethical tone, not surprisingly, psychological safety, openness to dissent, an ongoing assessment of whether the stated values actually match the lived experiences across the organization. So what's next, right? The draft is out for public comment. I believe, if my memory serves me correctly, the comments are being taken through July 11th of 2025. And COSO is actively seeking input from practitioners, regulators, and investors, and so on and so forth. That means that there's an opportunity right now for compliance professionals and governance leaders to really shape this final version. I'm going to launch my comments in shortly. But whether you're part of an internal audit team or in the GC's office or in a compliance function or on a board, this is a chance to weigh in on what effective governance should look like in 2025 and beyond. I'm not saying that they'll read or they'll take everything that comes across as sort of, gospel, but, it is your chance to really speak your mind. So in closing for today, and while I appreciate everybody else's comments, the corporate governance framework is really a timely, in my opinion, and much needed tool for strengthening how we lead and execute in an era of that's really defined by complexity and constant disruption. And, and it encourages organizations to move from reactive governance, which is what I always usually see, to proactive foresight, which is really where we want to be. And to ask hard questions before crisis hits, and to lead with clarity and ethics, and to align purpose with performance. So if you haven't reviewed the draft yet, I strongly encourage you to do so. It really is not just a framework based on my read. It's a call to modernize governance in a way that's smart, strategic, and sustainable. And does it provide answers to everything? The answer to that is no. But again, I think the biggest thing that I got out of this was the whole fragmentation of all these different frameworks, and really, are there truly blind spots? And that is one of those things that when we do root cause analysis from something that failed, and we go back and someone says there's a governance failure, if you dig a little bit deeper, if you ask the next why, the reason why, more likely than not, is because there are these other frameworks and there are these blind spots. And so this is also a call for me to really rethink how we do root cause, and to really see how these frameworks actually come into play, which is something that I actually never thought of before. So thank you for your time.
So, Jonathan, could you maybe walk me through your last thoughts around how we might rethink a root cause analysis using one or more of the COSO frameworks? Because I had always taken the sort of thought that they were obviously could be used independently, but they were broad enough and general enough that they could cover what you might have termed the blind spots. Is that analysis, you think, no longer valid, or perhaps never was valid?
No, I think if you're going to do a proper root cause, and obviously, there's different ways of doing this, and you're going to try to find the one domino that fell. Obviously, you have to keep asking why. Why this, why that. And again, we've talked about this a lot. But when you look at COSO and sort of the principles that are outlined here, and if you really go back and look what I talked about, like oversight, strategy, culture, people, communication, and resilience, you can have a communication failure, which could be a reason why that this particular override of a control or this bad thing actually happened. Okay, we get that. But why did that communication failure happen? Is it because we lacked understanding? And so that's why I think it's challenging me to go back and really look at this and say, hey, look, I never thought about the fact that there's a NIST framework, and there's all these different frameworks out there. And if everybody is not cohesively thinking the same way, they may be communicating, but they may not be communicating effectively. And so really my comment was around the fact that, hey, we're trying to find the one domino that fell, and that's great. But now it's kind of opened me up a little bit to say, well, okay, fine, it may be a communication breakdown, but why did that communication breakdown actually happen? Again, going one level deeper. And if it was because, that someone was abiding by and following some framework, which may be plausible, but there may be something else here that, there may somebody else's view might be a little bit different in another part of the organization. There could be obvious blind spots. And so what I think this is trying to do is trying to eliminate that and create sort of this one language type of discussion, much like when we do risk assessments, and everybody rates things 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then all of a sudden you have other risk assessments that are done in other parts of the organization, and they're high, medium, and low. And so, that becomes problematic in itself, because if you're doing an enterprise-wide risk assessment, an ERM project, and all these things are supposed to flow up, and you're not all ranking risks in the same way, well, then who at some point synthesizes all that or bridges all that and kind of changes them before they actually get to the mothership? And the answer to that is sometimes it doesn't happen. And so there is no harmonization. They think there's harmonization, but there really isn't. I think it's the same way with these frameworks.
Matt, question or comment for Jonathan?
Just more a comment for everybody listening. I would encourage you to give the draft framework a read. It is out for public exposure. COSO is looking for feedback through, I think it's July 11th. I looked at it. I think there's a lot that's good in it. I also think it's very big. It's 24 principles, which I think is the biggest framework they've ever had, and several points of focus behind each principle and whatnot. So I wouldn't be surprised if it gets pruned down. However, this is there for the compliance and governance community to use. So go take a look and give your comments to it, and maybe the final framework will be even better and more useful. That's all.
All right. And now over to our special guest panelists, Hema Lomax. Hema, what have you been thinking about?
Oh, I'm always thinking, Tom, but I've definitely been thinking about things like these frameworks that Jonathan and Matt have just been talking about. I love that there's an opportunity to weigh in through the comment process, and I like that call to action, Jonathan. We should. At the same time, what would I like to say to COSO and these people that are building these frameworks? I'd like to say maybe it's time for GRC professionals, governance, risk, and compliance professionals, to start looking inside at what they do and how they can fix the frameworks and really think about who they're serving. Like, look outside to the employees and the customers that we're serving. So think of compliance, risk, and governance as a service. We can spend a lot of time, a lot of the 500 million can be spent on checking ourselves against framework standards and guidance and seeing if we've got an effective program against those standards. What I've been thinking about lately is, well, what would my customers say about the service I'm providing? And now let's think about that. Who are my customers here? The C-suite, the investors, the B2B businesses, the actual retail customers, and my employees. So I'm starting to look at my compliance activity through that lens. When I ask if it's impactful, is it decision useful? I'm trying to figure out, well, first, who's making the decisions? And I've talked a lot about how we need to help our customers get where they already want to go responsibly, swiftly, safely, strategically. And so a lot of the questions I have around that. And so, I like to talk about the employee experience and the customer experience as two separate things. So I'd like to say we've got a problem as governance professionals if we're not looking at that lens. I mean, Jonathan, Marks, you mentioned with different frameworks, there'll be inefficiencies, inconsistencies, blind spots. But the real impact of those things is on the confused employee or the customer that can't trust our products or what we're selling. So let's start there. What do they say? Happy employees will make happy customers. Let's start with the employee experience first. If these frameworks are making me pile on more and more processes, activities, friction for the business to get where it wants to go, that's not a great employee experience. And we all know, was it Maya Angelou that said people will forget what you said, but they'll remember how you make them feel. And oftentimes our profession inadvertently positions itself as the hero in the story. We are going to protect the company. We are going to stop the insider threat. We're going to make sure that those pesky employees don't do what they shouldn't. And we'll get to AI in a second. AI needs to be taken care of next. But if we're the heroes, who's the villain, right? The villain in the story happens to be the employees. Or every time we interact with them, we're treating them as the villain. And so I'm looking, and I've got more questions than answers for sure, but I'm looking for ways to be more impactful in that space. Like, how can we bring the employees along so that they can be the hero in their own journey and we actually position ourselves as a useful guide, a decision useful guide? How can we crowdsource risk intelligence from them? Let's face it, they know more about the risks they're facing than we could ever know in our siloed functions. So what are we doing to get that data in? And what are we doing to get decision useful, relevant data out to them in real time, dynamic data based on the information that we have access to? So are we turning our risk register with the traffic lights, Jonathan, into decision useful information for any of the employees? Is it helping them navigate the turns and the curves? Those are the kind of questions I like to ask myself when it comes to the employees. And of course, leveraging technology to do it, right? So if you're still using long surveys, employee surveys, big long forms for disclosures, it's going to feel like friction. And at this moment in time, we're going to need to keep up, right? That employee experience will be dictated by the technologies that are available to us. They don't want to read a policy book. They want to use a policy chatbot to get an answer quickly, fast, to get on their way. So that's the employees. Same with the customers. When we make it difficult for our employees, for example, to build a product, let's talk about privacy, data protection. These things are difficult, right? We then make it difficult for our customers to use the product or to implement the product or access the product. And so we've got to be thinking about how our policies impact that customer as well. Now, the good news is you'll be loved by your teams, your leadership, if you're speaking in the same language: customer success, customer experience, customer support. That's what we need to be thinking about. So I'm going to pivot now a little bit, Tom, to using the customer experience lens for our AI responsibilities as well. I was reading an article this week. It's actually about a case that happened in April where I don't know if you know the AI-powered code editor Cursor. One of their users noticed that when the developers switched from laptop to mobile phone to their other devices, they were being logged out automatically from this developer tool. So it got on to the chatbot to ask, the question, what's going on there? And Sam, the chatbot, responded to say, well, actually, there's a policy that says that you cannot use it on 2 devices without buying another subscription. So there's another issue here about whether this is an AI hallucination, but I want to use this story to talk about the experience. So this went viral, it got onto Reddit. Everyone understood that this policy had been communicated to this user, and they decided to share their views on it. And the one thing they shared was, well, this blows through the experience of a developer. It's critical to the user experience for there to be you to be able to switch devices. Think about it. The policy that was being communicated to the customers was completely at odds with the way that they interacted with the policy, with the tools. That's important. It's important to think about what policies are being written and how they're impacting the customer. That's the lens I want to go to. Come back to the confabulation in a moment. Juxtapose that with the Air Canada case that was I think probably a year ago too now. You have to help me when that was. When the chatbot was in a customer service role and it offered a refund to a customer in a certain circumstance that the company did not want to offer. I think you know that Air Canada fought this. They actually said, hey, that chatbot's a separate legal entity. We don't have to, we're not responsible for that. Another example of customer service through the AI chatbot. And this time it was better customer service than the company wanted. Now I use these 2 cases to highlight that what we do impacts the customer experience. The policies we have, whether it's a refund policy or a you need 2 subscriptions to use 2 devices policy, those things impact the end user. And my question is not so much worry about those 2 chatbots that are in the news for confabulations, for hallucinations. I'm not too worried about that because that's going to get better. I'm thinking about what we, as compliance professionals, are doing to train those customer-facing bots when it comes to the customer experience. And are we thinking about that when we devise our policies? So this is an interesting take, I think, because I'm talking about designing our compliance policy with the customer experience in mind, the end user's experience, and making sure that, forget AI hallucinations, there aren't discrepancies, inconsistencies, inefficiencies in the way that our policies impact those customers. So I'll pause there for a second. I know we're going to talk about the confabulations as well, but any thoughts on the customer experience as a guide to how we go about governance, risk, and compliance?
Emma, you and I have had the opportunity to visit on this, so I have some familiarity with it. Is the focus on the customer experience something that you see or hear about in the compliance community, or is it still right now focused on the employee experience?
Yeah, that's a fair question. I think it depends on what type of compliance you're working on. So if you are in a privacy role, a data protection role, cybersecurity compliance role, you should be very much thinking about the customer experience. You probably are the author of a trust center that is customer facing. So you know how your policies directly impact not just the product, but the user experience of that product. Another example is if you're in social media, for example, you're going to have policies that you oversee that govern the use of your products by the end customers. So certainly some areas are thinking of that. I don't think in terms of the other areas, it's really a focus because we're not really thinking beyond our GRC world, right? The board and the CEO and the people that we report to most often. What do they say? What gets measured gets done. So if you're thinking about reporting hotline numbers and training completions, that's because that's what you've been measured. Are you thinking about customer satisfaction? Then you're going to start measuring that. And Tom, the only other thing I'll add to that is we have seen, haven't we, an increase in talk, at least, about culture surveys for employees. Sometimes we do ethical culture surveys, so we get the customer satisfaction from our employees that way. Oftentimes what I'm seeing now because of survey fatigue is you have a couple of questions in the employee engagement survey. And, it should be asking questions about the service that we are giving, but oftentimes it falls short. Oftentimes what it's asking for is, do you know where the hotline is? Do you know where the code of conduct is? Are you comfortable speaking to your manager? Those are not really talking about the service that we are giving as a function. And as I said, keep your eye on the friction that we're providing when we're not helping our employees get where they want to go. What they don't want is to complete their compliance training. What they want is to do the job they've been hired to do. And so we've got to make it value add for them. We've got to make it easy to do, relevant for them, dynamic, real time, just in time. And it has it has to feel like, and I say feel is important as well, that it's helping them get where they want to go, not stopping them or slowing them down.
I think I've had quite a few cases over the years where we've looked at this, and and as Punter Southall Law, we've looked at this recently on you know, our compliance team as a service team rather than some mythical overhead. And I think in law firms particularly, there's a we'll let the fee earners do that. We'll let the secretaries do it. And the compliance team almost increase the burdens to reduce their burden. And we've had a process of looking at it holistically. So, you know, looking at being neutral initially of who bears the burden of doing what. How can we look at the burden of a whole as a whole and then seek a fair division of it? And that's been a really interesting exercise that we've done over the last 6 months or so. And partly what prompted that is I've been doing some client work that I think has touched on that. So we did a investigation for a large US listed entity. And one of the reasons for the fraud was the effort in onboarding a new customer. So some people in some parts of the world would just book bits of work for an existing customer rather than have the hassle of opening a new one. So it's not just a service cost, it's a compliance cost as well, because then you get into all sorts of issues on books and records and misstating your accounts, etc., etc. It's quite a snaky path there, and there's no compliance benefit by making people invent an alternative process that they'll use to go aside your process if it's not right. And I can think of all sorts of examples over my career. You know, I can remember a mobile phone business where they said managers have to approve a certain thing, and they introduced a card system, had to go in the side of the PC. And net is if you went into any of that client stores, you were dodging this card being thrown all the time because they never followed this process. They just threw the card around the store each time. And you've always got to go and look at how people use these processes on the ground. And quite often, unfashionable thing to say, quite often compliance is part of the problem. It's often inherited systems that people just haven't fixed when they've come in.
I love that you bring that up, John. And I'll just say, you know, back to the point, this is not just compliance trying to be liked, as you said. This drives real value in the company if we can unlock this friction. And to your point, I said about helping people get where they want to go. They are highly incentivized to get where they want to go in other parts of the company. So they will find a way to get there. And if you're wondering why they're not using your processes, it's because they are bypassing them and that because they're too much friction. So I see this as an existential issue for compliance. If technology improves and it can replace our processes, we're done. We really need to think about our role in the experience. And I'll stop there.
All right. Well, lady and gentlemen, we are now off to fan favorites, shout outs and rants. We'll take the same order. Mr. Armstrong, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Marks, and Dr. Lomax. And then Tom Fox batting fifth.
I've been thinking
Mr. Armstrong.
I've been thinking about Operation Spider's Web. So many of you will remember February 28th, that meeting between Zelensky and Trump, where Trump effectively said to Zelensky, you're a busted flush, you've got nothing, you can't continue this war. So part of the Ukrainian response was this attack using 117 drones inside what looked to be wooden hand-built cottages, which seem to have destroyed 34% of Russia's cruise missile capability, 41 aircraft destroyed, apparently a cost of $7 billion, although I don't know how you value an aged Russian bomber fleet. But some people say the most critical thing is the diminution of Russian AWACS capability, so early warning capability, the ability to allocate fighter jets and drones to task. Russia apparently used to have 42 of these planes, the A-50 Berev mainstay. It now may have as few as 4. And in my mind, it's somewhat equivalent to Operation Chastise, the Dam Busters raid in 1943. Then World War II was sort of going against the Allies, and the RAF had a bomb invented by a guy called Barnes Wallis and a group of very skilled aircrew led by Commander Guy Gibson, and they took out some bombs which some say changed the war. My daughter did a project on this where she interviewed a German guy who was stood by the dams as they collapsed, and she asked the sort of question that only children, I think, could ask, because adult researchers wouldn't dare. And she said, when the dams were falling, there was chaos all around you, you could see the water flowing. Was your first thought about the marvels of British engineering? And the guy said, no, it wasn't. But he said that in his view, Operation Chastise was the turning point in the war. Why? Because he said that Germany had been told that their military machine was the best, that they were more or less invincible, and that they were going to crush the opposition. And he said, as a whatever he was, 12-year-old kid, that was the day he started to think that all of what they'd been told wasn't true. And this may be the turning point in the Russia-Ukraine conflict as well. I know people in Russia are reevaluating what they've been told about the might of the Russian military. And this might turn out to be one of those turning points that maybe also proves Trump wrong.
Wow. You oftentimes set the bar, Mr. Armstrong, but I think you have set it very, very high. Matt Kelly, what do you got for us?
Well, I have a bit of a rant and shout out at the same time about the same person who, of all people, I'm here to discuss Marjorie Taylor Greene, the Republican and congressman who is widely known as being nuts and pretty dumb. My rant, or as people might recall, last week, or in our last episode, I had a rant about House Republicans approving a proposal to ban states from regulating artificial intelligence for 10 years. I think this is a bad idea, and we should not do it. Much to my surprise, Marjorie Taylor Greene has now come out in favor of a ban, or she's come out against imposing the ban. She thinks that states absolutely should have the right to regulate artificial intelligence. She is a big fan of states' rights, which is, I suppose, true. And she also is very wary about the power of AI. So my shout out to Marjorie Taylor Greene is thank you for seeing the perils of this ban that your party has pushed through. And now she says that if she has the chance, she will vote against it. My rant about Marjorie Taylor Greene is that she said that she is now opposed to this because when she voted for it 2 weeks ago, she hadn't read the bill and didn't know this was in there. First, disappointing, Congressman Greene, that you do not listen to our podcast and do not read Radical Compliance. I've been writing about this for weeks. Second, I am, in fact, not surprised because she is, like I said, pretty dumb. Marjorie Taylor Greene is the one who thinks that Jewish space lasers were responsible for California wildfires.
There were.
My other big gem of Marjorie Taylor Greene, people might remember that when monkeypox, there was an outbreak of that several years ago. She was very confused about why children were contracting monkeypox because everybody knew that monkeypox is a sexually transmitted disease. People, if you think monkeypox is a sexually transmitted disease, do the world a favor and just don't have sex with anybody. However, that's Marjorie Taylor Greene being dumb, voting for things she does not read and does not understand, but at long last has come to her senses and realized that what she voted for, a ban on AI regulation, is in fact bad. We shouldn't do it. She is now correct on this. So, Congressman Greene, welcome to the revolution. Please stick by your guns. And if that piece of legislation is still in the final bill, go ahead, vote against it because we should.
As the former head of the Serious Fraud Office once said, I had a Damascene moment and the scales fell from my eyes and I saw the light. Mr. Marks, what do you got?
Can you hear me?
Can hear you.
All right. Well, it's really tough to compete with Armstrong and Kelly. So, but I was thinking about what I was going to talk about this week, and this is kind of something that's a little bit near and dear to me. So, it's really not the person who made the headlines or the one who posted the polished LinkedIn humble brag, not the company that threw a launch party for doing the bare minimum. So my shout out this week goes to the quiet professionals. And what I mean by that is the ones who show up early, stay late, fix problems no one else even saw, and never ask for credit. The ones who don't need a memo to know why integrity what integrity looks like, who carry broken systems on their backs and still manage to deliver a good work product. So you won't find them on stage. You won't see them in a press release. But they're the reasons why our projects and our work succeed, and clients stay happy and reputations are built. So thank you for that. So here's to the grinders, the problem solvers, the ones who don't just do the job, they elevate it. This week's MVP to me, or the shout out, goes to the quiet professionals, and that could be you.
Emma, you got a high set of bars.
I'm just going to mic drop and say goodnight. Oh, yeah, I can't top that. So I'll leave it to you, Tom, to bring the bar back up in a moment. So my rave today is I was at the SCCE regional conference in the DMV just yesterday. So my rave is for all regional conferences and regional get-togethers. It was wonderful. We kicked off the event with Amy Wilson, founder of the Culture Shift Studio. Nick Gallo was there talking beautifully about the ROI and compliance. Carl Hahn closed it out. It was a really great session. But as always, the best part about it is to get together with the other professionals in the community. So thank you to the organizers. It was wonderful. My rant is about being late to the party. I have learned a lot about podcasting with you, Tom Fox. And you're one of my favorite podcasters. But I've now got a new favorite set of podcasters. I haven't named them yet, but they're two AI podcasters. And if I put my thoughts and my resources and my sources into a Notebook LLM or a Gemini, I can generate in an instant a very good podcast between these two hosts. And so I'm ranting only because I'm late to the party. It's incredible technology. It can only get better. I know we're all going to be keeping up, but I feel very privileged that I'm learning what's out there. And I know, Tom, you and I are going to continue having conversations about this new technology and what it means for the compliance podcasting community. But that's definitely my rant is, oh gosh, why didn't I know about this earlier?
Well, you didn't know about it earlier because it's came available about 3 months ago. So you're not that late to the party. I am going to shout out to Wells Fargo. I have excoriated Wells Fargo for many years because of their fraudulent account scandal. But this week, the Federal Reserve lifted their asset cap. And this turned out to be one of the best penalties of any regulator for a company. And there are several reasons I'd like to go into this. First of all, in 2018, they handcuffed Wells Fargo to a 1.39 increase in overall revenue per year until the order was lifted. The company at that point had John Stump, the CEO, who had been with the company and developed the phrase "8 is great." He had left the company. His predecessor didn't seem to understand the gravity of the cultural miasma the company was in, and just thought, well, we'll slap a few compliance controls in place and go on forward. And that was completely insufficient. So they brought in a third new CEO, John Schraff. And Schraff basically said, we're going to get this company right. And executives' number one task was to put effective compliance in place, completely change the culture of the company. And they were able to do so because of the penalty. And I know that may sound counterintuitive, but what it forced the company to put these compliance and ethics controls and cultural changes in place, but it also allowed them to do that because they could focus on growth. And so over the past between 2017 and 2024, Wells Fargo missed a lot in growth. So PNC Financial grew over 47%, Bank of America 43%, Citigroup 27.7%, and Wells Fargo actually went down with 1.1%. But here's where the magic happened. Risk-rated assets between that same time went down for Wells Fargo. So they didn't have growth, but they actually lost risk. So this was pretty eye-opening for me. Now, for those who don't think you can literally spend 80% of your time on compliance and still make money, in 2024, Wells Fargo was the number 2 bank on full year return on common equity. PNC Financial, 11.82, Wells Fargo, 11.44, Bank of America, 9.52, and Citigroup, just over 6%. So this was a fabulous example of where a regulatory penalty actually has made the company better. And now the company is poised to move to areas of higher growth, but they have the culture in place and they have the framework in place in terms of internal controls to manage the new risks that they're going to take on. So this is one of the finest examples of regulatory oversight and penalty that I have ever seen. In the past, we've talked about monitorships, and some companies will crow about how the monitor really helped them. Well, here it was the penalty that helped them. And that's not something I'd seen before. So I want to shout out to, I guess I should include the Fed and OCC because there's the one that levied the penalty. But I also want to shout out to Wells Fargo for doing what Jonathan Marks said, the quiet professionalism of doing compliance day in and day out where they had to. So, ladies and gentlemen, what a great Everything Compliance. I can't wait till we get back together. And Hema, you're definitely coming back.